quick before she starts again. Is this on? Good evening. Thank you for coming back in the frigid cold of the Southern California autumn. I know that lots of folks have lots of feelings. And I know that some have come tonight with a sense of elation and anticipation, and others have come tonight with a great deal of sadness and worry and anxiety. And it's all appropriate, obviously, because it depends on where you stand on this nation's future. My experience as an American going through this is that it's never as good as you thought it was going to be and never as bad as you worried it would be. And we'll have to see how that turns out. Let me just say two things. One, because I don't want to address that tonight. That's not the topic of this lecture program. And it's really not an appropriate use of our time together. But if you do have strong feelings and would like to just share them and talk to somebody, I'm going to be here tomorrow and Friday and Shabbos and next week. And you're always welcome to come upstairs. My office is just upstairs. If you let me know you're coming, I'll have some coffee warm for you. And we can sit and talk either way about your feelings, anxieties, worries, anticipations, hopes, all of that stuff. Okay, that's number one. The synagogue is here as a place where we can have that kind of supportive conversations. And second, and you know me, and you know that no matter where you stand politically, I'm going to listen. And I may disagree with you. I may agree with you. I may tell you where I think you've missed something. I'm happy to share resources of the stuff that I read. And that conversation is always acceptable and welcome. And second, that we have had a reputation and a practice over this last generation or two, since my teacher, Rabbi Schulweis, led the community, of having serious conversations about serious issues. And as these changes in American politics go forward, we will continue to have serious conversations about serious issues. And we've done it in an atmosphere of civility and decency and mutual respect and listening and learning from each other and from people who know a lot more about this stuff than we do. And that's called education. We are not afraid to bring people who might disagree with some of us, because learning to hear opinions you didn't walk in with is exactly what education is about, and that's one of the functions of this institution. American culture doesn't really have anymore a lot of institutions of what you might call political education. There aren't a lot of places to go and hear reasoned conversation, reasoned thinking about important issues of our common good, which is really the definition of politics, our conversation about the common good. And so one of the functions that Valley Beth Shalom has taken on is to be a place of those reasoned conversations of the common good. And I think that this election and its aftermath is going to call forth some very interesting and very deep conversations. And I hope to have those conversations. I hope to lead those conversations. And I hope that you'll come and join us for those conversations, because we can explore together what all this means, where we're going, what the future of this country is, what the future of Israel is. I don't know if you noticed in the news, because it didn't make the front page, but Israel had a political crisis this week as well. In fact, some people think that the political crisis in Israel is almost equal to October 7th in terms of its implications for the future of Israel. So there's another set of topics that you could worry about tonight if you'd like. All of this we can add to our conversation, and I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about all of this together. Okay? So, having said that, everyone take a big deep breath. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Turn around, say hello to the people behind you, say hello to people next to you, say hello to the people in the room. Is it on?
Yeah, but this wasn't loud, so I didn't know what mic.
You have to turn it on the... Okay. Yeah. Yes, good. Good. Well, before you sit down, stand up again. Stand up again. One more thing before we finish. One of my teachers, one of my rabbis in the world, is a wonderful, wonderful philosopher. We've had him here many times, named Yitz Greenberg. And Yitz Greenberg used to teach us that it doesn't, in the Jewish world, it doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, or none of that, as long as you're ashamed of it. So tonight, my dear friends, it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, Yellow Party, Blue Party, as long as you're ashamed of it. Let's say a bracha together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. So as we get consumed with anticipation or anxiety about the days to come, it might be comforting and it might be a source of wisdom to look backwards to the days that were. And that is our theme for tonight, for next week as well. We're looking at the great American Jewish century. Who shaped American Jewish life in the century, how it shaped, how we came to be the Jews that we are. My dear friend, Professor Stephen Mueller of Hebrew Union College, taught us last week, and I'm going to ask him to begin the American Jewish experience and the Jews who shaped our lives. Professor Windmuller.
Good evening. Some of you may not have been with us last Wednesday because there was something called a World Series. Sure. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to very quickly just frame what we tried to accomplish in our first session as a way to, because I don't want any of you to fail this course. The core principle of our founding session was that we asked the question, is this the end of the Jewish American experience? Are we in some measure seeing the transition that historically drove and changed Jewish lives in other places? Was that happening here as well? Anti-Semitism, a kind of discomfort and uncertainty about our place in a changing society, our sense of America as being in some measure not as welcoming and as supportive, even with regard to Israel and other themes. And we tried to explore some of the principles that help to create and define a system that we created and have really thrived through in the context of this past 150 years. We spoke about denominationalism and federations. We spoke about the context of the role and rise of synagogues. We talked about the scope of the great ideas that shaped and framed the American Jewish experience. Tonight we want to go somewhat deeper into some of the particulars of how this community evolved and became what we have called the Great American Jewish Experience. It's not working. Maybe it's not on. Every synagogue needs an Ilana.
Can I tell you how hard all the real tech people in the whole building would laugh if they heard that?
There we In so many ways, these two men, Rabbi Isaac Leeser and Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, would help frame the American Jewish experience. Because they came to this country both out of a European context, but realized that this was a different moment in the storyline of the Jewish people. And they had to figure out a way by which to create out of these new immigrants, these new Americans, something that was genuine and focused as American Judaism. But they had very different ideas. Leeser was Orthodox. He was committed to various core principles of translating great texts into English and bringing them to the audiences of Philadelphia, where he was a rabbi, and to create a kind of presence in this country where we would see the ordination of rabbis, the availability of a Jewish press, the creation of a seminary, the ability to construct a whole series of institutions that would serve this new and emerging community of 50,000 Jews in the early part of really this 19th century discourse. He would be the architect that on the one hand saw this as a chance to create an American Jewish experience that was tied deeply to Jewish tradition. His competitor, in some ways, Isaac Mayer Wise, they actually met, but their lives did not quite intersect as we would have observed. While Rabbi Leeser was situated in Philadelphia, Isaac Mayer Wise, who started in Albany and then got in a fistfight on Rosh Hashanah, which led to the creation of a separate synagogue in Albany, would ultimately end up in Cincinnati. And he would be the founder of what we would call American Reform Judaism. He would define a kind of alternative to Leeser, where Leeser wanted tradition to dominate. Wise wanted to allow for an American Jewish experience that was tied to the notion that Jews would be able to interpret tradition and move from some of the rigidity and tradition into a different modality that situated itself in the American context. He creates the Hebrew Union College. He creates the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He forms the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, known today as the URJ, Union for Reform Judaism. He is a builder, as was Leeser, but his scope was clearly in a different focus. He too would create a newspaper, the American Israelite, which still exists today in Cincinnati. And he would become the sort of framer of this new idea in America, having sort of captured it from his German Jewish experience. He would bring it to this society. But those were, from the religious perspectives, a way to define American Judaism in this new context. But there would be other needs and other players. And three extraordinary women would be the definers and creators of central and core institutions of this country. Henrietta Zold, most of you know about and may have a deep and abiding connection with Hadassah, and certainly know her story. She was the daughter of a rabbi, and she was a deeply educated and knowledgeable woman who really saw in the opportunities to create human and social service. And out of that, she would form and deliver through her passion for being a Zionist and being part of the Israel pioneering experience of the early part of the 20th century. She would certainly see the hospital and the medical field as a central way of creating ways to meet the needs of those arriving in the Yeshuv. There would be two other extraordinary women at the same time. Lillian Wald, who would be the architect of the Henry Street settlement. And her story is constructed around a very interesting notion. Her belief in the notion that you needed to create Americans out of these immigrants. And the Settlement House philosophy was this very idea of creating a different kind of American, someone who would give up his or her Yiddish and would be taking on the language, the culture, and the social experience of the United States. The third player would be the creator and resource for the National Council of Jewish Women. It would be a kind of women's sisterhood, a women's movement to find ways to bring women of all different backgrounds who were arriving and integrating into the American experience. And Harriet Solomon would be that person. And she would envision the notion of creating the role that women ought to play in the construct of a new society, as the NCJW would emerge as an important voice in the American women's movement. And to this day, both Hadassah as well as the National Council of Jewish Women retain their distinctiveness and their roles as major institutional players. But there were other builders of all different types. Jacob Schiff is one of those who would be part of this extraordinary development of wealthy, emerging American Jewish bankers, investors, and also very serious philanthropists. Schiff would be involved in helping to create the Jewish Theological Seminary. He would be a clear and essential focal point for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC. He would be instrumental in ultimately creating and assisting with the federated system, federations. He would be a builder, and he would bring to that table that network of philanthropists that were part of his world, that were part of the sort of generation of well-to-do New York business and philanthropic leaders. Lewis Marshall was one of his partners in that, but Marshall had a particular focus. It was a focus on dealing with Jews in crisis globally. He's the founder and former of the American Jewish Committee. In 1906, we remind ourselves of the Kishinev pogrom and the committee's response by organizing literally a committee of influentials. And Marshall took it upon himself to build that and to create that framework for institution building and for being a voice in defense of Jews who were themselves defenseless. But Marshall would be more than that. He would be present to assist Schiff in the founding of JTS. He would be active at Temple Emmanuel in New York. He would be encountering Stephen Wise, a great and important figure of American Zionism and American Reform Judaism. And he would in battle with Wise because of their great differences in perspectives. Marshall was an elitist. He saw that there were people who were ordained to be powerful and ought to deliver that power on behalf of Jewish interests. Stephen Wise, as you will recall, creates the American Jewish Congress as a counterpoint to the American Jewish Committee, literally saying that the masses of people ought to be represented in public policy and in the voice of American Jewish advocacy. So these two were both in play in terms of their competition and engagement. And the third of these is Louis Brandeis. We spoke briefly of him last week, but Brandeis is very important because he allows us to make the comfortable linkage, as Rabbi Feinstein reminded us, both on his Rosh Hashanah sermon and also last week, of this connection of where Zionism was part of one's Americanism, and that the two were not in conflict, but were very much married or associated one with the other. So these three figures are significant, but they represent more than themselves. A justice of the Supreme Court, an outstanding attorney in the case of Louis Marshall, a significant business personality in Jacob Schiff. but they all were part of that delivery of creating these national institutions and ideas that would drive 20th century American Judaism. Now, I have picked William Rosenwald for a very personal and specific reason. Rosenwald is the son of Julius Rosenwald, the founder and builder of Sears and Roebuck. He is the second son of that Rosenwald family. His older brother would run Sears and Roebuck, and he would become a major New York philanthropist and player. His father was deeply committed to building a kind of connection between American Jews and African Americans, and was a major investor and creator, as with his son, in the formation of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. But it would also be the Rosenwalds who would fund the black colleges in the South, extensive investments of millions of dollars to help launch education for African Americans. But William Rosenwald was also very deeply concerned about what was happening in Europe, 1933, 1945. His secretary was my aunt, and she worked with him for over a decade. And my aunt made one request of William Rosenwald. You see, she said, there's a family sitting in Germany unable to escape because one of the members of this family had polio. And under U.S. immigration law of 1925, the Johnson Immigration Act, a person not of sound body or mind could not come to the United States. And polio was seen as a detriment. Rosenwald turns to his friend, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and makes a request. Mr. President, you have survived polio. You have risen to the most important point in this country. I now have a favor to ask of you. I need you to rescue a family. Otherwise, they would not be eligible. And with that, Franklin Roosevelt signs a waiver that permits my parents to come to the United States. Yeah. So I picked Rosenwald for that personal reason, but also because he was symbolic of a type of generational leader who is uniquely powerful, obviously influential. And when I had occasion to meet his son, I told him this story because it was a kind of reminder, even to his kids, of the impact of their father. Rabbi Joachim Prinz is a really interesting player. He is a conservative rabbi who has fled from Germany to Newark. But he becomes a very clear spokesperson for much of American Jewish life as a leader of institutions and as an articulate proponent of civil rights and human rights. So he is seen here at the March on Washington 1963 with Martin Luther King because he was invited to deliver a prayer. And the prayer, or at least a portion of that prayer, is seen here on this slide. The importance here is that Rabbi Prinz seeks to point to the connection of why it is important for Jews to be in defense and in support of others, just as they must stand up for themselves. And it is a beautifully defined expression of that deep commitment. But there are numerous other players we could cite, the hundreds and literally many writers and great authors of the Jewish people and of American literature. I just picked here one writer, but what I really meant to describe to us and for us is that there were particular themes that these writers dealt with. And if you know Philip Roth and you know the host of other writers of the mid-20th century, you will know that they were grappling with questions associated with how Jews fit or did not fit into the American context. Younger writers, as reflected here, are referenced in the context that they don't have to worry about identity and status, but are concerned about the issues of where Zionism fits into their lives and into the culture of their being, where issues related to Israel and its relationship to one's identity and to one's participation in the American story, or to other extraordinary themes of how we assimilate and when we push back against assimilation, and what we do in the context of an intermarried situation. And the 21st century writers are telling us that they struggle and they are trying to articulate in their letters, words, and messages these complex ideas of Americanism and its impact on us as Jews struggling to deal with particular issues and particular moments in time. And then there are comedians, the hundreds of Jews who have played a role in American theater and on the stage, and certainly in comedy. And in so many different ways, these players, these actors, were actually telling a story. And I think that story is particularly significant because I think in so many ways they were dealing with trauma of their own families or of a community or of the Shoah, whatever it may have been, and putting it into some frame of reference, even a point of humor, in order to simply survive and move beyond. And they were very much anti-authoritarian. They would challenge every idea, every personality, every character, because that was what a comedian would do and needed to do. And of course, they had chutzpah. They had the capacity to say things that none of us could get away with. But they were always sort of in play in this moment of extraordinary capacity to bind their American identity with their Jewish historic experience. And that was a generation that also really has shaped and touched us. And I put them in because I felt that left out, they would be a missing piece to the true and extraordinary storyline of where humor has really been part of Jewish culture. There's a sentence here at the beginning of this slide, which I think often is never noted. 85% of Americans have a favorable or very favorable view of Jews. And this is taken from a Pew study of just last year. Sometimes we think we're in trouble, that we're rejected, or that we are embattled. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that the contributions that Jews are and have made in this society are understood and are seen in a very favorable context. And I think that is an important reminder for us as we sort of look at the Jewish experience from this point of view of grappling with identity and community and realizing the extraordinary imprint we are and have made. I think all of these players and characters in their own way were looking to promote equality and civil rights, and certainly in the messaging and activities that they generated, in infusing American culture and the arts in ways that we can see through the literature, the comedy, the music, and the words of these individual players. And they demonstrated their patriotism. Last week we referred to Irving Berlin, but so many other such characters and players were constantly trying to reaffirm their love and their compassion and their ties to America. And they contributed to American innovation and excellence in all the ways that they delivered organizations, ideas, and their talents. And finally, I think they provide, through their different venues, a kind of leadership of what it may mean to be someone of excellence in a particular career or field, and of extraordinary capacity to tell a story, or to create an institution, or to build a relationship. So with that, Rabbi, I'm going to step away and let you do the magic of continuing this journey of teaching.
The old-fashioned way to hand out a packet of text. I may walk around. No, leave it, it's fine. Yeah. Well, thank you, Steve, that was wonderful. So Professor Wimmuller has given us the view from 50,000 feet. Given us a view of the great Jewish American century and some of the ways in which it was shaped by extraordinary personalities and some of the ways in which those personalities made a major impact on American life. What I want to do is now come down to earth, come down to ground level. And I want to look at the development of the generations of American Jewish life. And the way I want to do that is through the lens of one institution. I want to look at the historical development of one institution over the course of the century. And the institution I'd like to look at with you happens to be the one I'm most familiar with. It's the synagogue. The most important American Jewish institution is the American Jewish Synagogue. More Jews belong to synagogues than any other Jewish cause, institution, or organization. 85% of American Jews at one point or another in their lives will be affiliated with a synagogue, right? And according to the Pew Study of Jewish Identity, something like 89% of American Jews attend some sort of synagogue worship service on the high holidays. Some of them fast, some of them don't fast, but they all show up. So let's take a look at the history of the synagogue, not only for its own sake, because it's some great stories, but also for for a view of how these generations of American Jewish life developed. Shall we do that? Let's begin with the precursor. You remember that the first Jews to come to America were Sephardic Jews. The first community came to Stuyvesant's New York in 1654. And then in the 18th century, the 1700s, there were Jews who came here from various places in Europe, but the largest group were Sephardic Jews who came from either Brazil or from Holland. And then in the middle of the 19th century, we had a large community of German Jews who came. 1830 and 1848, there were revolutions in Central Europe, and Jews moved to America. It was still a very small community relative to the population of America, but now a significant enough community to begin building institutions. And our story is going to begin on the eve of the greatest immigration, which is going to begin in 1884 and proceed until 1920. Just before that immigration showed up, in the Judaism of Isaac Mayer Wise, of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and of Isaac Leeser in Philadelphia, we find this statement. This is a statement in the New York Herald, which is Pulitzer's newspaper. So it's not a Jewish newspaper. It's an American newspaper. And an editorial goes as follows, 1872. Ready? To maintain Judaism in America, something more than a mere recitation of prayers in Hebrew and German is necessary. The people, that is the Jewish people in this generation, are much more intelligent than they were a century and a half ago, and any religious system which keeps up not with the progressive spirit of the age must expect to meet just such a crisis in which the Jewish church in America now finds itself. What was the crisis? How do we get the young to come back to the shul? It wasn't called a shul, it was called a temple. The rising generation, that is the second generation of German Jewish immigrants, the young, the rising Jewish generation, demand a form of religion which their hearts can appreciate and hold fast to. though they ask for no change in the true spirit of religion at all. And it is the attempt to confine them, this is a great phrase, to the iron bands of the system of bygone ages. What a great phrase. That has produced results which the Hebrew press so generally and frequently laments, namely, that the young Israelites do not manifest that love for the synagogue which their fathers and forefathers showed. So if you're frustrated that your kids and grandkids don't come to shul, welcome to the history of American Judaism. Rightly understood, this very religious indisposition is actually a sign of progress, which calls loudly and earnestly on the Jewish church, that's what they called it, to furnish such spiritual food as young American souls can digest. In other words, there was a spiritual crisis in the community even before the Great Immigration came. In the second generation of German Jewish life, there was a spiritual crisis of getting the young to come and participate. And then it came. 1884, the whole landscape of American Judaism changes, right? The Tsar gets assassinated in Russia. His brother takes command of Russia as the new Tsar. It's Nicholas who gets assassinated and Alexander who takes over, but it doesn't matter. And he has a policy to get rid of the Jews that populate Russia. Russia at that time owned what was called the Pale of Settlement, which was that sliver of land between Poland and Russia. Ukraine, Poland, Russia. Many of you come from there. If you ate gefilte fish on Yontif, you come from there. If you're lucky enough not to eat gefilte fish, God bless you. And the Tsar's ministers decide there's a very simple solution to this. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. We'll kill 1/3 of the Jews, we'll drive 1/3 out, and we'll convert the other 1/3. So to kill the Jews, the government begins to sponsor a series of pogroms, of government-sponsored riots, to roust the Jews, kill as many as you can, get the peasantry, distract the peasantry from their terrible situation by blaming it on the Jews. Some of you are here because of those pogroms. The second third move out of the country, get on boats, and come to America. The other third, is the reason I'm here, is because the way they would convert young Jews was by drafting young Jewish boys into the Tsar's army. When my grandfather got his draft notice at the age of 9, his family put him on a ship and sent him to Newark, New Jersey, where he then thrived and my mother was born. That was why we're here. So 2.5, I'm going to sit down because my back is hurting. 2.5 million American Jews, new American Jews, arrive in Ellis Island, New York, Savannah, Georgia, and Galveston, Texas. They sent them to Galveston because New York was getting crowded. And this is the story of New York. How many of you are descendants of those immigrants from Eastern Europe? Yeah, so a great number of us, Now, if you ask American Jews, tell me about your great-grandparents who came to America, they all tell you the same thing. Rabbi, my great-grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi. Very Orthodox. Only Orthodox rabbis were allowed out of Europe. Craftsmen, tradesmen, horse thieves, card sharks, none of them left. Only very Orthodox rabbis. It's quite remarkable. So you imagine that they came. And my grandfather, they were very traditional. Center for Jewish History records this story. In the early 1900s, New York City, most notably the Lower East Side, was overflowing with synagogues. Most of these congregations grew out of Landsmannschaften. Landsmannschaften, that is, clubs of people from the same neighborhoods in Europe gathered together as a social club to speak the old language, to tell the old stories, to eat the old food. And as a way of sort of disguising it, they call it a shul, a synagogue. Societies that were developed out of groups of predominantly Eastern European Jewish immigrants who came from the same hometown. These congregations were concentrated in areas where their compatriots, whether Hungarian, Litvak, Galician, or others, lived. And by the way, they hated each other. If you were a member of the Rumänische Shul, you wouldn't be caught dead in the Polish Shul. Just know that. I learned this from my grandparents, right? Most met in rented rooms in tenements or storefronts and meeting halls. There were many buildings that housed several congregations simultaneously. The congregations were minimally organized, had limited resources. In most cases, they didn't have a permanent rabbi. Congregations members took turns leading services. The synagogue was much more than a place to pray. For active members, it was an entire way of life. Well, that sounds nice. The Lower East Side was honeycombed with synagogues. Except when you came to America and you got a job in a sweatshop, you worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, which meant living an Orthodox lifestyle became very questionable. And there's a couple of ways we know this. One of the ways we know this is this. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, estimates of the proportion of New York's adult male Jewish population that attended weekly Sabbath services ranged from 5 to 40%, most trending toward 20%. That is, 4 out of 5 Jewish men didn't go to shul Shabbos. Now, they may have kept Sabbath in some fashion, but highly Orthodox life was not what they practiced. The attendance level of women and children was unreported, but undoubtedly even smaller. The other way that we know that the Orthodox lifestyle was not kept, there's one way to count and decide how many Orthodox Jews live in a neighborhood. You know how to do it? Count the mikvahs. You know what a mikvah is? A mikvah is a ritual bath that Orthodox women go to, or traditional women go to, at the end of their menstrual period, right? So if you have 1 million Jews living on the Lower East Side, you have to figure out what percentage of them are of childbearing years, and you count up and you discover that there was 1/10 as many mikvahs as there should have been. Meaning that when our ancestors came to America, they weren't also Orthodox. There's a very famous story about Zayda who calls a little Einikal Bai, little boy, and says, listen, when you grow up, I want you to do something for me. He says, what's that, Zayda? I want you to become a marine biologist. He says, what do you know from a marine biologist? I want you to dive to the bottom of New York Harbor and retrieve all the tefillin and all the prayer books that were thrown overboard when the boats entered the harbor and the people saw the Statue of Liberty. For many Jews who came from Eastern Europe, America was a release not only from the tyranny of Eastern Europe, but of the tyranny of the Jewish communities they were raised in. So it wasn't so Jewish. It was more Landsmannschaften. It was a place to speak Yiddish. There was Yiddish theater. It was a place to eat Jewish food. There was Katz's Deli and the Garden Cafeteria. It was a place, you read a Yiddish newspaper. There were a dozen Yiddish newspapers ranging from middle of the road to socialist to communist to ridiculousness, you know? And that was the culture. It was a cultural Judaism that was celebrated, but not necessarily religious Judaism. The really interesting story is what happens to their children. When Professor Mueller puts the slide up about Jewish American authors, so many of those authors were of that second generation of American Jews. They were the children of immigrants. Now you can imagine the children of immigrants. They inherited Jewishness, a cultural Jewishness from their parents, and a deep loyalty to their parents and their parents' culture, and at the same time, a deep desire to become assimilated into America. Assimilated into America. And so there is a conflict between the two. How many of you have ever seen the film The Jazz Singer? Okay, any of the versions, by the way. There's the Al Jolson version, the Danny Thomas version, and the Neil Diamond version. God help us. You remember the story? What's his name? Jackie, what's his name? Anybody remember? We have to look this up. He's a brilliant singer. His father's the Chazan. Yontif is coming. The high holidays are coming. The father wants him to sing the high holiday liturgy, but he's invited to give a concert of jazz music, which he's also adept at. And the question is, which will he choose? Which identity claims him more? And I want you to watch all 3 versions of the movie and tell me who wins in each version of the movie. It's very interesting which wins in each movie. And you can see the movement of American Jewish life by tracing that story. The first version is made when? In the 30s. It's the first talkie, 20s. And then the Danny Thomas movie is when? The 40s, 50s? And the Neil Diamond version is, well, you get the picture, right? I guess I'll have to do another one with Gene Simmons or somebody. I found a book. I found a book which became very important to my research for my doctoral dissertation. I love libraries. I love bookstores. There's very few of them left in the world. I was perusing the shelf in the American Jewish University Library about American Jewish life, and especially the history of the synagogue. And there was one volume sitting on the shelf which had no tag on it. It's like catnip. So I pull this thing down, and this is what I discovered. In 1925 and 1926, the New York Board of Jewish Ministers, that's what it was called, the New York Board of Jewish Ministers held a series of conferences, monthly meetings, called Problems of the Jewish Ministry. Each meeting featured one of the great rabbis of American Jewish life giving a paper, giving a talk, and then two other rabbis would respond. It's a remarkable book. Among the articles there, because it's a picture, it's a snapshot of that moment, 1927, in American Jewish life, in the words of those who were the characters who were leading it. Here's an interesting article. The article that I quote here is from Rabbi Israel Goldfarb. I'll tell you who he is. He's a European immigrant, Orthodox rabbi. He's the rabbi of the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, which is still there, by the way. He has two claims to fame. He officiated at Aaron Copland's bar mitzvah. He was very close to the Copland family because he was a musician, and he actually was a professor of music at the Jewish Theological Seminary, my seminary, while he was the rabbi of the synagogue. It doesn't say, by the way, that Aaron sang his Haftorah to Appalachian Spring, although I suspect that he did. And the other thing that you know, some of you know who Goldfarb is, because every Friday night you sing, Shalom Aleichem. He wrote that melody. And many other melodies that we sing in synagogue today. Now, he's an Orthodox trained rabbi. It means he knows Jewish law cold. He knows Talmud cold. What he doesn't know is how do you talk to kids in a second generation American synagogue. And he writes this piece. Of all the problems that beset the American rabbi of today, none is more complex and more difficult to solve than that of how to bring the child closer to the synagogue, how to arouse his interest in things Jewish, and how to secure his permanent attachment to the ideals and faith of our people. We are not the first generation to face this problem. This problem, which is of vital importance to the future of Judaism in America, was completely unknown to our predecessors a generation ago. Because in Europe, you lived in a totally Jewish environment. That environment raised kids. But now that kids go to New York public schools and they hang out at the public park, who's going to teach them how to be Jewish? And that's what he says. And so the problem isn't just that, right? Here in America, however, where the Jew has lost his firm grip on his ancient heritage and where his loyalty to the traditions of the fathers has weakened so much, here where the child moves from morning until night in a non-Jewish atmosphere, the question of inspiring his interest in the synagogue becomes a difficult task indeed. And then he says the real problem is that the synagogue is screwed up. Look at the last paragraph. American synagogues are, with few exceptions, without traditions. Their foundations are not rooted in the firm rock of Israel's historic experience, but are, spiritually speaking, flimsy and tottering structures, swayed by the slightest wind that threatens collapse. Their educational system disorganized and faulty. Their religious services mechanical, lacking in decorum and uniformity, in spirituality and sincerity. It is a wonder that under these conditions, the Jewish child is crushed beneath the upper and nether stones of indifference and neglect. So all of you who have grandparents who said, oh, in my day, everyone came to shul. Nonsense. This is what he's facing. So he came up with two solutions, with two very famous solutions. One I curse him for. The two solutions he came up with, he gathered up all the boys who were having bar mitzvahs, and he made a big deal of the bar mitzvah. Up until that time, if you had a bar mitzvah, you came to shul on a Thursday morning with your dad. They taught you how to put on your tefillin. You had an aliyah. Then you sat down and had herring and schnapps. Your father went to work and you went to school. Genug, that's a bar mitzvah. Goldfarb moved it to Shabbos morning, invited the whole community, and then he did something really tragic. He invited the caterer to come into the synagogue and serve a big lunch. And then it became a competition. DJs, not yet, but that's coming. He invented the American bar mitzvah. The other thing he invented was very clever. The boys started to learn with him, and he was a very attractive, very loving guy because he loved music and he was fun to be with, and the boys loved learning with him. They learned with him on Shabbos afternoon, and then they'd all go together to play basketball. And after the kids finished their bar mitzvahs, the boys said, "We want to stay with you." So we started the first Jewish youth group in a synagogue called the Akiba Society. And then the sisters of those boys came to him and said, "Why can't we have a group?" So he started the Rachel Society. And the first Jewish youth groups in a synagogue were invented by Israel Goldfarb in Brooklyn, New York. That was his solution, because he started to understand that what a rabbi needs to know is not just Talmud, but he needed to look at the experience of his own people. And the experience of his own people was wanting this situation. This is one of the rules of synagogues, right? One of the things that we who run synagogues know for sure. The saying is that every generation gets the synagogue its parents would have been proud of, because the synagogue moves slower than the culture. And he knew he needed to move the development of his synagogue forward. That's what he did. There were other people who had a different idea. They had a much broader idea. And their idea was very simple. If you're not going to come to services because you're not religious, but you're looking for a social connection because you're not comfortable participating in the outside world yet, but you want to be attached to Jews sometime, so let's create a synagogue that meets your needs. This was called the Synagogue Center. Anyone ever been to the Brooklyn Jewish Center? Has a fabulous gym, a terrific pool, classes on everything, right? Israel Leventhal was the rabbi of the Jewish Center in Brooklyn. And what they did was Israel Leventhal, look at the third source on the next page. The synagogue must be Sha'ul Keneged Shamayim Va'aretz, a thread connecting heaven and earth. It must aim at uniting heaven and earth, the highest ideals of our religious life with the needs of everyday worldly life, so that Aretz, earthly activities, may reach into Shamayim and touch the very dome of heaven, and through the inspiration of our heavenly ideals, mold a better, nobler existence here. He had English classes, citizenship classes, knitting groups, mahjong groups, men's groups, basketball leagues, sports leagues, summer camps. The idea that a synagogue isn't just a place for prayer, but is a place for the totality of any Jewish experience, and the totality of the Jewish experience is legitimate. And the person who wrote the philosophy of this, he didn't make it up, he simply articulated best, was the great philosopher Mordechai Kaplan. Some of you remember he was Rabbi Schulweiss's teacher, right? This is what Kaplan writes in his magnum opus of 1934, Judaism as Civilization. Judaism is something far more comprehensive than Jewish religion. That's a remarkable statement, right? That the synagogue should be open to far more than just religion. It includes the nexus of history, literature, language, social organization, folk sanctions, that means mitzvot, standards of conduct, social and spiritual ideals, and aesthetic values, which are in their totality form a civilization. What endangers that civilization is the irrelevance, remoteness, and vacuity of Jewish life. There's little at present in Jewish life that offers a field for self-expression to the average man or woman who does not have a taste for praying 3 times a day or studying Bible and rabbinic writings. There's nothing in any of the current versions of Judaism to hold one's interest as a Jew. That's a pretty strong statement for a guy who was a rabbi, right? So my teenagers might tell me, but not. Activities that might hold one's interest and through which one might express oneself as a Jew have not been recognized as part of Jewish life. If Judaism is to be preserved amidst the new conditions, it must break the narrow frame of creed and resume its original function as a culture, as an expression of this Jewish spirit and the whole life of Jews. It will encircle the whole life of the Jew and give content and color to its highest functions and activities. For Kaplan, Judaism is whatever Jews are doing. So if Jews want to play basketball, that's legitimate. If Jews want a knitting circle, that's legitimate. This opening up of the synagogue to far more activities gave us a whole new picture of an organization, and it needed to be done in the second generation because the second generation did not inherit their parents' attachment to religious Judaism, but still wanted to be culturally Jewish. And just so you understand how Israel Leventhal is the rabbi of the Brooklyn Jewish Center, who was sort of the dean of this movement. He believed that it had to be quality. So the art director, the arts and crafts director of the Brooklyn Jewish Center was Mark Rothko. The drama director of the Brooklyn Jewish Center was Mace Hart, who then left to come to Hollywood and become a big producer. And the cantor of the Brooklyn Jewish Center was Richard Tucker, who sang in the synagogue on Friday night in Shabbos and sang for the New York Metropolitan Opera the rest of the week. Because he believed if we're going to offer culture, let it be good. Why should it be second rate? And this movement of the synagogue center became the sine qua non of the second generation, and it addressed its ambivalence of being both an American and a Jew. And then comes the Second World War. When the Second World War comes, three things happen. Hundreds of thousands of American Jews leave home in the tenements of New York and Chicago, and they're shipped across the country for basic training, right? People in my family ended up in Georgia. People ended up here in California. And then many of them were shipped overseas. It was the first time they'd been in a multicultural, pluralistic environment, away from mom and dad and away from the Jewish community they knew. And when they came back, when the war ended in 1945, they came back, three things happened. The first thing happened is they married their sweethearts and decided this tenement apartment I'm sharing with my parents is too damn small. I want to live where I can have a little breathing space. Anyone ever hear of the guy named Arthur Levitt? Yes. Arthur Levitt had a brilliant idea. The way we won the war was by building battleships, tanks, and other implements of war on an assembly line by Henry Ford's methods. Why not build homes the same way? Up until then, if you bought a home, it had to be built by craftsmen on one spot. It was your home. What Levitt did was buy a huge piece of property in the middle of Long Island, build a tract of homes. There were 3 designs and 3 colors. And a returning GI with his new young wife could buy a 3-bedroom house with a nice little backyard for $2,600. Complete. And there was a rule, by the way, no fences. Because he was afraid that if you got stuck in the house, you wouldn't know who your neighbors were. So he said no fences. That was a zoning rule. And you first had Levittown, New York and Long Island. And then you had Levittown, New Jersey, which today is Cherry Hill. The LA counterpart to Arthur Levitt was Boyer. And Boyer built Canoga Park, where I grew up, and Woodland Hills. Same way. 3 designs of houses, 3 colors, your choice. And you build hundreds of homes at a time, and young American Jews moved out of the tenements and into suburban neighborhoods. And where they found themselves was far away from their networks of family and friends and connection. So they needed connections. And they came to synagogues, or they built synagogues, or they established synagogue communities for the purpose of making connections. The other 2 things that happened, by the way, you all know this. People not only moved out of New York tenements up to Westchester or Long Island, but having been in the South or having been in the West, why would I want to live in a place where it snows? And the big population movement to Florida and to California. The San Fernando Valley, between 1945 and 1970, was the fastest growing section of the United States of America. The whole valley was created during that time. Now, that really presented a problem. See, if you lived in Highland Park, Illinois, or you lived in Long Island, New York, you could come into town to your parents' synagogue for Yontif. But if you moved to L.A., and worse than L.A., the Valley, where were you going to go? The other problem was the birth rate in the United States before the Second World War. The way they measure it is children per woman. 1.9 children per woman. In other words, just below replacement rate. What was the birth rate following the Second World War? How many of you were born between 1948 and 1964? Congratulations. 3.7 children per woman. That was the baby boom. If you're the 0.7, I know that's why you need therapy. The baby boom. You had a huge bump in population. So now not only do you have families separated from their Jewish communities, separated from their circles of relationships, separated from their extended families, they're stuck at home with kids. And you had an ideology that that's where women were supposed to be. Dad went out to work, and mom stayed home with the kids. Anybody remember 1950s and 60s television? Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, The Life of Riley, The Danny Thomas Show. Am I hitting a nerve here? Remember? Ward and June, and the Beaver and Wally at home, right? And every night, 5 o'clock, Ward would come home whistling, and he'd hang his hat for his fedora and put down his briefcase, and there was June cooking an entire dinner in one pot in high heels and pearls. And then the family sat down, Ozzie and Harriet, and they had a wonderful meal, and any problem you might have could be solved by Dad's homespun wisdom and Mom's oatmeal cookies, and that was America. Except it was lonely. If you were far away from your family, far away from your friends, far away from your community, in a new place, in Canoga Park, California, or at Levittown, New York, you were lonely. So what did we do? We found each other. This is the membership brochure from the Israel Community Center of Levittown, New York in 1948. Listen to this. Many of our people have had little previous contact with synagogue life, having hitherto regarded the synagogue as the province of their elders. Many have not seen the inside of a shul since their bar mitzvah. Now, however, they feel it's time that they grow up, and they have consequently acquired a renewed interest in synagogue activity. The responsibilities of parenthood have led many to rethink their position with regard to the Jewish heritage, which they now seek to maintain, in order to transmit it to their children. In Levittown, this return to Judaism is facilitated for them through the existence of a synagogue consisting of like-minded young Jewish parents. Why did they create the synagogue? Was it because they had a deep spiritual need to connect with God, Torah, and the Jewish faith? No. They wanted a synagogue for two reasons. One, to create a social space where they can meet fellow Jews, and two, to raise their children as Jews. The ambivalence of the second generation gets passed down to the third generation. How so? Well, I'm not sure what it means for me to be Jewish, but I know that I have to get my kids to be Jewish. And so Herb Gans, who's a sociologist at University of Chicago, does a study of the new Jewish communities. It was called Park Forest, but it really was Highland Park, Illinois, just north of Chicago, right? And this is what he writes. The Sunday school, much as other institutions, the community started as a Sunday school in someone's kitchen. The Sunday school, much as other Jewish institutions, is recognized as an ethnic rather than religious institution. More correctly, an American reaction to an ethnic situation, which transmits ethnic behavior and identity. The Jewish home, however, is run by American middle-class behavioral patterns. The women, fearing that the contradiction between the traditional Jewish home, whose features are now incorporated in the Sunday school curriculum, and the American home, which embodies their primary present-day values, would lead to family tensions. So although they wanted their children to learn about traditional Jewish life, they did not want it brought home. Make my kid a Jew, but not too Jewish. And so synagogues exist to bring families together for social activities, to engender a sense of ethnic identification, to bar mitzvah kids. Bar mitzvah now becomes a verb, to bar mitzvah kids, but not for Jews to really participate in. So I gave you the statistics here in the next source. Jack Wertheimer gathered statistics. How many hundreds and hundreds of congregations were created during this time, mostly in suburban neighborhoods, right? By 1970, there were so many synagogues. I'll just give you the period. It says during just 1 2-year period, 1950, 131 new congregations joined, joined United Synagogue, that's the conservative movement, and 50 with the Reform movement. The Reform movement's Union of American Hebrew Congregations grew from 290 temples in 1937 to 698 in 1970. The same period, conservative movement went from 250 to 832. In other words, there was a boom in synagogue building. So you'd say, wow, what a religious generation. Not so fast. Attendance at religious services, by contrast, did not keep pace with the membership growth. A survey in 1945 found that only 24% of Jews claimed to attend religious service once a month, compared to 81% of Catholics and 62% of Protestants, and mere 9% of Jews claimed to attend synagogue once a week. According to Gallup, a decade later, which is 1955, the figure of Jewish once-a-week synagogue rose to 18%. In other words, people built synagogues, joined synagogues, but didn't go. They went on high holidays, but they didn't go the rest of the year. That's American Judaism, this ambivalence about America and Judaism. And that becomes the sine qua non of third-generation American Judaism. There were its critics. And one of the most vociferous of those critics was a great Jewish philosopher named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who in 1953 addressed my union, the Rabbinical Assembly. They went to the Concord Hotel, which had fabulous blintzes, and he talked to the rabbis. And it's a very long speech. I just gave you a paragraph here. Our services are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth. Everything is present, decorum, voice, and ceremony. But one thing is missing: life. Nothing is going to happen to the soul. Our motto is monotony. Don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. The fire has gone out of our worship. It is cold, stiff, and dead. Inorganic Judaism. Has the synagogue become the graveyard where prayer is buried? The modern synagogue suffers from a severe cold. An incredible critique. Because what happened was we copied the style of worship of American Protestants, and it lost all of its flavor. And because there was no real religion there, it was simply an ethnic exercise. Heschel critiques it, others have critiqued it. And you have this community, and its principal value is not loyalty to God, not loyalty to Torah, not loyalty to Jewish tradition. Its principal value is survival. Survival. It had a nicer name. It was called continuity. In 1970, the Canadian Jewish philosopher Emil Fackenheim, who himself was a survivor of the Holocaust, who'd been in Theresienstadt, but was never taken to Auschwitz, he writes a small tract called about the history and Jews in history. And in his tract, he makes the following claim. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. We now have a 614th. And the 614th commandment was, don't let Hitler win. We must not hand Hitler posthumous victories. Which meant that the community now turned to survival, and its anxiety was directed at survival. Its resources were directed at survival. There's only one small problem with that. You can see what the problem is. If you build a community devoted to the Jewishness of its children, but not to the Jewishness of its adults, then children think that when I grow up, I can get rid of this just like my parents did. Right? It's like driver's education. Right? You take your driver's education until you get your driver's license, and you never set foot in a driver's education class again. And so Hebrew school became a preparatory to bar mitzvah, and when the kid had his bar mitzvah, he disappeared, she disappeared. Right? And so what happens is you raise a third generation American Jews with this profound confusion about who exactly and what exactly we are. And when they grow into adulthood, we have that same kind of really interesting ambivalence. Same kind of ambivalence, and it's charted in a wonderful book by Steve Cohen and Arnie Eisen. And they put it very quickly. I'll just put it very quickly. They looked at all the extant the extant the extant studies of Jewish demographics, and they interviewed a group of Jews. And they came to this conclusion. The single most important finding of our study is decidedly double-edged. Now, that's a great Jewish thing to say. It's like Talmudic, right? On the one hand, the American Jews we interviewed, their first language that our subjects speak is by and large one of profound individualism. Their language is universalist, liberal, and personalist. Community, though a buzzword in our interviews, a felt need, even a real hunger, is a second language subordinate to the first. Our subjects, like Americans more generally, do not speak it often or well. Community and commitment are repeatedly redefined and apprehended by our subjects in terms acceptable to, and here's the phrase, sovereign, ever-questing selves. In other words, you have to convince me that I want to be Jewish. And you have to show me that it's good for me, or that it's going to be interesting to me. And you have to fashion a Jewish life which meets my needs. And if you don't ask me for commitment. You have to come to me and make me feel like I want to be part of this thing. Only in those terms is commitment possible and community permitted to obligate the self. They repeatedly reconsider which organizations and charities they will join and support, and to what degree and to what beliefs they will hold, which loyalties they will acknowledge. The self is and must remain autonomous and sovereign. I had a friend who was regular here in the shul, came every week. I thought he was my friend. We were friends. He was good friends. And then one week he stopped coming. And the second week I said, oh my God, something must be wrong. So I called him up. I said, what happened? Are you okay? He said, yeah, we're fine. I said, you stopped coming? He said, yeah, we're into horses now. Now think of that. I'm looking for a place of connection, for a community. I'm looking for a sense of meaning. I found it in the synagogue, but now I'm into something else. Right? I have a neighbor who's a dear friend, was also a very active member of our shul, and then he stopped coming. And I asked him, what's going on? He said, I really enjoy the shul, but I decided I want to be more traditional. So I go to Chabad. I said, it's wonderful. Do you like it? They said, wonderful. The rabbi's wonderful. The service is a little more traditional than you guys. It's great. And I really find that really speaks to me. I said, wonderful. I said, listen, Chabad ends about the same time we do. Why don't you come over for lunch after shul? We'll talk. He said, I can't. He said, you can't come over after shul, Yom Shabbos, to have lunch? He said, no, we go to Costco after shul. With a straight face. With a straight face. There's no, I'm choosing my Jewish experiences according to what my own personal needs are, and there's no sense that there's anything out there objective that claims me. So that's the first, sovereign, ever-questing selves. And then the other one is, yet here, here's the other thumb, ready? Yet here, the postmodern story breaks in, right, weighs in. Postmodern means I can have layered identities that sometimes are contradictory. Here's what they say. The labor of fashioning a Jewish self remains deeply significant to these moderately affiliated American Jews. We can state with confidence that the quest for Jewish meaning is extremely important to our subjects, just as the search for meaning is important to contemporary Americans more generally. Middle range, that means not the most committed and not the least committed, middle range American Jews seek an abiding significance in their lives that goes beyond the activities of daily life. They readily discuss their highly searches for transcendent meaning and confess, to a degree that surprised us, to a belief in God. Our subjects report a strong desire to find a sense of direction and ultimate purpose, and to find it entirely in the framework of Jewish practice and belief. I want meaning, and I want it in Jewish language. But I want it on my terms. You hear the ambivalence here? It's a very interesting, complex kind of identity. Now, just quickly, because I know you're getting tired, what happens if we move this one a generation ahead? Now you get the next generation, which is what, Gen X, Gen Z. And if you look at this, this is a study not of Judaism, but of American religion in general, written by a young American author. She's a very interesting woman. She's now a Catholic. She was something else before. Back in 2007, 15% of Americans called themselves religiously unaffiliated, meaning that they didn't consider themselves to be members of any traditional organized religion. By 2012, that number had risen to 20%, 30% when it came to those under 30. 30% of Americans under the age of 30 consider themselves of no religion. Now those numbers are higher still. And I would tell you, just anecdotally, that among Jews it's even higher than that. About a quarter of American adults say they have no religion. Now when you look at young millennials, those born after 1990, those numbers reach 40%. And they're called nones, N-O-N-E-S, because when they're asked to check a box, what are you? Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, they check the box labeled none, N-O-N. So they're called religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, right? They are often known single biggest religious denomination in America and the fastest growing. While more and more Americans say they don't belong to organized religion, that doesn't necessarily mean they aren't spiritual. A fully 72% of the nuns say they believe, if not in God or the Bible, at least in something. In other words, our nuns may not be traditionally religious, but they're not exactly secular either. And she goes on to say, the story of the rise of religious nuns, it turns out, isn't about nuns at all. It's about people whose spiritual lives, sense of meaning, community, and rituals are a blend of what you might call traditional religious practice, personal intuitional spirituality, privileging feelings over and experiences over institutions and creeds. Millennials aren't rejecting religion, they're remixing it. And more Americans envision themselves as creators of their only bespoke religion, their only personal religion, mixing and matching spiritual and aesthetic, experiential and philosophical traditions. We do not live in a godless world. We live in a profoundly anti-institutional one. An interesting insight? It's not that people aren't spiritual or looking for something. They're just not going to attach themselves to an organization to find it. You ever go to Starbucks? Once upon a time when you went into a coffee shop, you ordered a cup of coffee. If you lived in New York, you went to Chock full of nuts. It was either light or dark, one sugar or two, right? You know what I'm talking about? If you don't know Chock full of nuts, then just forget that last note. Now when you go to Starbucks, what do you order? Right. A double half calf with a oat milk espresso frappuccino with a squeeze of lemon. You can have it, there's like, someone once counted, there's something like 90,000 combinations on the Starbucks menu. People do religion the exact same way. People do religion the exact same way. Why am I bound? On my television set, once upon a time, there were 7 channels, 3 networks. Now there's 570 channels and God knows how many networks. Why can't I do religion the same way? I want it my way. Now, what do we do as a Jewish community? What do we do as a Jewish community? I want you to notice, do you see the progression here? What's amazing, however, is these Jews are not ashamed of our Jewishness at all. They're just looking for something, and the question is, how do you build a community out of sovereign, ever-questing selves? How do you build a community out of bespoke religions? I gave you here, you can do this on your own, 2 examples of 2 very successful new communities. One is here in LA called Ikar, and this is their membership statement. And the other is a very successful community in San Francisco called The Kitchen. That's true, that's what it's called. And when I asked the rabbi, who's a dear friend of mine, why the hell did you call it The Kitchen? She said, when you come into a house, where do you gather? Called it The Kitchen. You can take a look at this on your own. I want to finish with one last thing. Okay, Steve, you want to come up and join me? We'll finish. We have no time, but that's okay. I gave you something fun on the back page. The reality of 4th generation American Jewish life is that we've made it. We are totally secure, unafraid, up until October 7th, unafraid to be visible, unafraid to show who we are, not ashamed of our Jewishness anymore, right? Anyone ever hear of the actor named Tony Curtis? What was his real name? Bernie Schwartz. How about Kirk Douglas? Isser Danilowitz, right? How Edward G. Robinson? I mean, every one of the great actors of the 40s had to change their name, but Jerry Seinfeld is Jerry Seinfeld. right? We're not ashamed anymore. We're not have to hide anymore. We don't, and there's a certain out there that's remarkable that my grandfather would not understand. So about 25, 30 years ago, Gilda Radner of blessed memory, in the last 5 minutes of one of the episodes of Saturday Night Live, which was the highest rated television show in this country, lit Hanukkah candles and said the bracha, and we all went, holy cow. We are 2.5% of this population. I mean, the Protestants in Nebraska know what they're watching, right? And then, if that weren't enough, Adam Sandler, also of Saturday Night Live at the time, got up with a ukulele and sang this song one December. You ever see this song? There's now 3 versions. This is the first version, right? There's a lot of Christmas songs out there, he wrote, he said, but not too many Hanukkah. So I wrote a song for all those nice little Jewish kids who don't get to hear any Hanukkah songs. Here we go. Put on your yarmulke, here comes Hanukkah. It's so much funukkah to celebrate Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the festival of lights. Instead of 1 day of presents, we have 8 crazy nights. When you feel like you're the only kid in town without a Christmas tree, here's a list of people who were Jewish just like you and me. David Lee Roth, he's the lead singer of Led Zeppelin. David Lee Roth, of what? Of Van Halen, sorry. David Lee Roth lights the menorah, so do James Caan, Kirk Douglas, and the late Dinah Shora, Bowser from Sha-Na-Na, and Arthur Fonzarelli. Paul Newman's half Jewish, Goldie Hawn's half too. Put them together, what a fine-looking Jew. You don't need to deck the halls or Jingle Bell Rock, because you can spin the dreidel with Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, both Jewish. Put on your yarmulke, time for Hanukkah. The owner of the Seattle Supersonics celebrates Hanukkah. O.J. Simpson, not a Jew. But guess who is? Hall of Famer Rod Carew. We got Ann Landers and her sister, dear Abby. Harrison Ford's a quarter Jewish, not too shabby. Do you understand what this means? Do you understand the quality of cultural security and pride that goes into something like this? On national television? This is like astonishing. From where we came at the beginning, right? And it's an ethnic pride, it's a cultural pride, and at the same time, it's a deep sense of security and cultural creativity. The other one I gave you was a little poem written by a young American Jewish poet named Andrew Lustig. And you can read it, it's really adorable. And it just shows you the permutations of Jewish identity. My grandfather would not have recognized this generation's Jewishness. But what he might take some pride in is that 4 generations after he lived, there is still a young Jew who's willing to get up on YouTube, and he wouldn't understand YouTube, and say stuff like this, right? I'm a collective pride, excitement that is felt when you find out that new actor, that great athlete, his chief of staff is Jewish. I'm the collective, and he goes on to the sense of belonging that a 4th generation American Jews have taken on. The last point, and I've said this before, so you've heard this in sermons over and again. In April of 1964, Look magazine, which at the time was the second most popular news magazine in North America, second only to Life magazine, published an article that was put together by one of its senior editors, Thomas Newman. It was called The Vanishing American Jew. And what he did was he took all the extant studies of American Jewish life, and he applied to them a sociological principle called Hansen's Law. Hansen was a guy that studied Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, and he discovered that the immigrant generation preserves its folkways and its ways of eating and dress and religion. The second generation is ambivalent because they want to be as American as they want to be loyal to their parents. The third generation may preserve the culture because it's kitsch. It's fun. It's Adam Sandler. By the 4th generation, American ethnic groups disappear. In 1964, Tom Newman said, we are now entering the 3rd and next 4th generation of American Jewish life. By 1980, American Jewish life will wane significantly, and by 2000, there'll be virtually no Jews left in America. ladies and gentlemen, Look magazine is gone, and we're still here. And that is amazing. There's something strange, interesting, and sociologically unexplainable about that, right? And that's what makes this American Jewish century so remarkably fascinating. So, you want to add something? Yeah, Is it late? It's 9 o'clock. We can take a few minutes for questions, as long as Ben and Jerry's doesn't close on us. Mark, go ahead.
The one thing I didn't see in here, which I'm a product of, overnight Jewish camping.
Yeah, well, we could give you a whole catalog of institutions and ways that, so overnight Jewish camping is very important. How many people went to Jewish camps or sent your kids to Jewish camps? Right. And then Israel. How many of us went on Israel trips or went for a year of college in Israel? These are things that change Jewish identity, And that's part of this story, okay? You're exactly right. Yeah, Bonnie, hi.
Original historians. Oh, I don't need the thing. I talk loud.
You do, because the whole world's watching.
Okay, when you put up the slide of Louis Brandeis and the other people who built some of the institutions, did they face anti-Semitism, and if so, what did it look like then versus what it's looked like here since October 7th, and were there things that they were doing to combat that? So just curious.
Well, as we know, the period, especially,
I just want to interrupt you just for a quick second. I want to say goodnight to Lil and Jess Beim, who we love, because it's their endowment that made this course possible and all of our College of Jewish Studies. And every time I say that, I embarrass the hell out of them, but I'm going to continue to say them because I love them, and I want them to stay warm and safe and healthy, and their daughter, and I want them to know how much we appreciate making this possible. So you guys have a good night. Take care. Be careful going home.
Drive at night anymore.
It's freezing outside. It's dropped down to a frigid 67 degrees, so be sure to bundle up. Stephen, go ahead.
so absolutely, from 1920 especially, the post-First World War, the extraordinary amount of anti-Semitism. Brandeis faced that both within the court culture, but also outside of the court. And we would see a good deal of that reflected as well in the work of the American Jewish Committee in terms of its international fight against anti-Semitism, and that was, of course, Louis Marshall. So, yes, in each case, these folks encountered different forms, but certainly a very real expression of that.
Yes. Please, Judy. Jay, you're next.
I probably don't need it.
For other people.
Okay. I grew up not in one of the big cities. I grew up in a small town of 350 Jewish families, a town of 65,000 people. And we had a strong Jewish community within our community. And I mean, so strong that when I graduated, we had one high school, and there were 700 kids in the graduating class. And you had a father, parents who ran the graduation party or whatever the heck it was, the dance and everything. And my father was chosen to run the thing. So has the research stayed strong in that? Or has there been any research about the fact that because this community was smaller and in a more diverse, and I didn't go to Jewish camp. I didn't, but we had naturally 2 synagogues.
Right.
We of course belonged to both of them, but that's beside the point.
Right. Exactly right.
Exactly.
Right.
But did that make a difference? Because I was one of those kids that
Yes.
came home, and if there was a platter of
Yeah.
baked goods, my first question is that for us or Hadassah or a sisterhood?
Yeah.
That was the culture of our.
Jewish life was
Community.
predominantly urban in big cities. New York, Chicago, Boston, Miami, LA, Denver. But there's a whole nother Jewish culture of small town Judaism. that had a whole different profile of identity and a whole different profile of attachment and organizational structures. And it's being studied in certain places. I'll give you two quick stories, and then I'll ask Steve to comment because he actually knows this stuff. I was working, my first job was in Texas. I was day school director and rabbi of a synagogue there. The young couple that came to join the synagogue, her name was Kennedy, actually. And they called me one day and said, my mother died. She lives in Texarkana. His mother was married to Mr. Kennedy. She's Jewish, he's not. He was actually a prison guard at the federal penitentiary in Texarkana. And they said to me, could you come and do the funeral in Texarkana? And I said, sure. So I got on one of these tiny little planes and flew to Texarkana, and I did the funeral for them. And their custom was that when the funeral coach was driving from the funeral home to the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, we passed the synagogue. They opened the doors of the synagogue. There's an adorable little synagogue in Texarkana, right? When Nina and I were on our way to Aspen a couple years ago, we drove from Denver to Aspen. There's a town halfway there called Leadville, and there's a synagogue. There's actually a museum there of Jewish life. There's all kinds of small towns, all kinds of small towns. You remember our dear friend Nancy Sher Cohen, her husband Bob, was a professor of film at UCLA, but his hobby was taking pictures. He's a brilliant photographer, gallery level, his works are in the Met. He did a whole volume. He went all over East Texas, where he came from, photographing Jewish cemeteries in small towns in East Texas. And he found all these remarkable graves in the Jewish section of tiny little towns in East Texas, because there were small towns. So small town Judaism was a very important phenomenon and has a whole different history than big city Judaism. Here's Steve.
The Institute of Southern Jewish Culture is trying to preserve Jewish communities of the greater part of the South, and precisely, these kinds of memories and experiences, and put that together in a way that will preserve some of these extraordinary stories of small-town American Jewish life.
Yeah, because the difference is in a big city, you can ignore it because everyone's Jewish around you. But if you're in Texarkana, you got to come to Shul Shabbos. That's the only way you're going to have any Jewish life. So it becomes a different dynamic. Jay, you have the microphone? Yeah.
I do. This is wonderful, gentlemen. Thank you. So, you took us on this journey, and it's absolutely incredible what we've achieved, especially given from where we've come, right? So, the Senate Majority Leader is a Jew, the Treasury Secretary is a Jew, the Secretary of State is a Jew. We have Jewish billionaires on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley. We have prominent Jews in Hollywood and the media, and they seem to have no problem speaking out when other minority groups are being threatened. But yet, it seems, if you look over this past year, when the Jewish community faced enormous challenges, Israel obviously faced enormous challenges, it seems like it was crickets. We didn't hear anything. These prominent Jews with all this power, in all these high places, when it comes to Jewish issues, they don't seem to want to stand up and support Jews in a time of need and crisis.
I disagree. I respectfully disagree. A group of Jewish hedge fund managers, put together a coalition, and they started saying, show us who the demonstrators are on the Harvard campus, because we'll make sure never to hire them, right? The American Jewish community raised $500 million in the 2 weeks after October 7th. The community did rise up. The community did rise up and push back hard. Now, you're dealing with a social movement that's difficult to get your hands around. So, and we're not exactly sure what strategies to use to push, but is it worthwhile taking college presidents in front of Congress and torturing them? Is it worthwhile? I mean, just asking the question, what's the strategy? How do you defeat an idea is the question. But I think that the community did push back and push back rather aggressively. Go ahead.
Right.
Catholic, who kind of led that effort. Hollywood, the big Jewish names, I think there were a couple examples, but for the most part, I think, for any other cause, Jews in Hollywood, the media, very vocal, but in terms of these issues, they seem to have a fear of speaking out on Jewish issues, I
Some
guess is the
do,
point I'm
but on
making.
the other hand, there was a letter circulated from people in the arts, literature, art, music, and film, boycotting Israel, saying we're going to boycott Israel. And recently, there was a letter published, and it had 1,200 signatories of major leaders in the arts community saying that's not American, that's not democratic, and it's hateful. And so people did sign their names to that letter. And I looked at the list, and some of them belonged to this shul, and there were lots of big names from Hollywood who signed that letter and signed that letter. You're right, some of them didn't, but many of them did. And I don't think it's worth it. If you want to inspire them to do more, that's fine. But I don't think it's fair of a blanket accusation to say there was nothing. I think there was a pushback in areas you could push back. The real question, Jay, is a really serious question. I had a long conversation with some people in Israel this morning about this very idea, which is, how do you defeat an idea? And how do you defeat an idea which is deeply entrenched, not generally in American culture? The American population, something like 85% of Americans support Israel's defense of itself. But how do you defeat that idea in college campuses, where it's deeply tied to an anti-Western, anti-American ideology? How do you defeat that in certain circles of the arts community, where it's deeply anti-bourgeois kind of idea? And how do you defeat an idea? That's a very interesting. People say, I want to fight anti-Semitism. Great. Anti-Semitism is an idea. It's not a thing. How do you defeat an idea? And our community hasn't figured that out yet. There's a lot of people screaming about it, which is wonderful. They're aware of it. They want us to be aware of it. How do you defeat that idea? And there's a lot of initiatives now, initiatives trying to figure out how to do that. That's, I think, a very important step in this response. I think you're right. There are some who do not respond, but there are others who do respond, and I want to salute those who do respond. Karen.
UTLA, which is
Yeah.
Teachers Union,
Right.
just came out opposed to having the Los Angeles School District have funds invested in things that may be Israel back.
Yeah, it's even worse than that, by the way. But they voted a very now there's a response to that. I just signed a letter on that area. There's a big response to that in the community. First of all, why a teachers union needs a foreign policy, and second of all, what they think why they chose that. I mean, so many questions about it that raise really serious and painful questions. And then there's been issues in particular schools. So I've had conversations with parents of kids in particular local schools, both public and private, asking for help in responding to a teacher's comments or a school's way of framing issues, and we've been helping them do that. And then I'm also very proud that there's some very, very lovely schools, both public and private, in our area that have really come across and supported the Jewish community against anti-Semitism and against anti-Zionism. And I'm proud of that as well. Michael in the back. Michael.
Very quick and quick to Professor Baker's slide. So you had a slide of 3 comedians. One of them was Billy Crystal. One of them was Mel Brooks. And I think who was the third? Lenny Bruce?
I think it was Seinfeld, yes. Tova Mervis. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't name her. Yeah.
One of the, Michael, before he passed away, Robin Williams gave a televised interview in West Germany. It was Germany, not West Germany. And the interviewer asked, he said, how come we don't have any funny comedians in Germany like you have in America? And Robin Williams turned to the interview. Robin was not Jewish. Turned to me and says, "Because you killed them all." which is brutal and funny at the same time. It was, and he did it, like Robin Williams is so quick. He says, "You kill them all." I mean, in order to have comedy, you have to have a certain distance from a culture. That's what Freud taught us, so that you can see the irony in a culture. And Jews have always been the masters at. What's really interesting, of course, is now that we've been here 4 or 5 generations, and become so comfortably American, are we losing that? And that's why there are fewer and fewer Jewish comedians and more comedians of other ethnic communities, because now they've taken up that mantle of distance to look at the culture and to laugh at the culture. Next week, we're going to explore some of the other areas in which American Jews have really shaped America and how America's really shaped American Judaism. Then we're going to turn to the question of what happened. What happened on October 7th and its aftermath to change our place here in America. And our last session will be on December 4th. We've invited a panel of colleagues and friends, rabbis and leaders of the community, to help us talk about what's coming next. What will American Jewish life be in the next iteration of post-October 7th, post this next generation of American Jewish life? I hope you'll join us. Take good care. Have a quiet night.